I came across an interesting paper that looked at the variation between countries in terms of how many people backed into parking spaces. And so this is yet another podcast on the series of backing into parking spaces. In this one, we look at a paper published by Professor Xiaomen Li named Predicting Productivity Gains from Parking Behavior. And what he discovered when he was visiting Taiwan is that his hosts went far out of their way to find a parking spot that they could carefully back into, even though this sometimes meant that they had to drive around the lot several times. And he wasn't sure if this behavior was unique to his hosts or a more generalized behavior of people in Taiwan. And so he did a small study where he asked friends of his in Brazil, China, India, Russia, and Taiwan, and the US to send him photos of everyday parking lots and everyday parking garages that were found at places like department stores and supermarkets. He then analyzed the photos to see how many had their cars parked backed in or parked, face with the front bumper, head in is the other term. So back in parking would be when the front of your car is facing the road, so you would just drive straight out. And head-in parking is the way which I think most of us in North America drive, where we drive the front of the car into the parking spot, and then we have to actually back out of the parking spot to get out. So here are the results. In the US, only 6% of cars back into parking spots. So almost 94% of people, according to this very small study, there's just a few hundred cars observed in each country, so not very large, but almost no one backs in, which is congruent with my observations here in Canada. In Brazil, 17%, in India, 25%, in Russia, 35%, Taiwan, 60%, and in China, 88%. Now, in his study, he then went on to try to suggest that the Asian values of delayed gratification were the explanatory factor, not only why people in certain countries backed in their car more, because they know later on it would be easier to get out, but he also tried to show, as you can look on the graphs on the article, that there is a direct correlation between the increased economic growth and productivity of these countries overlaid with the way they parked their cars. Anyway, you can evaluate yourself to see if these two observations are at all causally or correlated together. Anyway, in short, most countries outside the US seem to park back in their cars more. So the question I was wondering is, why don't we do it here in North America? And when speaking with my friends, most people agree that it makes sense to back in their car to a parking spot. And there's two previous blog posts to this one explaining the huge number of deaths and injuries that occur from backover accidents. And Tom and Ray from Car Talk also agree that backing into parking spaces makes sense. So the matter must be settled if they suggest it. From speaking with my friends, most people say backing into parking spots is harder, or they aren't good at it, which makes sense because we don't do it ever in North America, and so therefore it would be more difficult to do this type of parking maneuver. But that's obviously, something we could fix. It's very easy to go to an empty parking lot and try practicing backing in. And the newer backup cameras, which overlay lines on the screen, make it really easy to see where your car is going to end up going because the lines correlate with your steering wheel. One other observation would be that when I took my high school driver's test, a mandatory part of the license was parallel parking. And most people found this a harder part of the training, but with practice, most people were eventually able to get it. Perhaps if we were to add back in parking, specifically into parking lots, as another key part of the driver's licenses, and maybe some jurisdictions already have this, it might encourage for more people to pick up this practice. going through online forums on Reddit or Quora, trying to find out other reasons why back-in parking is not done, some people suggested that it's actually illegal in some US jurisdictions to back into parking spaces. And one of the hypotheses here for this is that the automated license plate recognition cameras would not work in some jurisdictions, because in those places, it's not mandated that cars have a license plate on the front and on the rear bumper. And therefore, if people were to back into a parking spot, the license plates will not be displayed to the patrol car as it drove by the vehicles. And that's one reason why people think that back-in parking might be illegal in some jurisdictions. Some other thoughts were that there might be concerns of property owners or parking lot owners that the drivers might accidentally bump into the wall if they back in too far and cause property damage. Other people suggested that if the car is idled, the exhaust will leave smoke damage against the building or against the wall behind it. Some other suggestions were that if there's a dining patio or a sidewalk on the edge of the parking lot, that if cars backed into those spots, the exhaust from the cars would pollute the patio or the sidewalk. And someone who was once working at a sporting event parking lot suggested that they actually forbid people to back into the parking lot because it took much longer to fill the parking lot, and their priority was to fill the lot as quickly as possible. They didn't really care about at the end of the game when the fact that nobody could get out because it was just a parking jam. So in conclusion, whatever the reason for why we don't back into parking spots in North America, one thing is clear. There are too many accidents from backovers, and turning our car around and pulling out forwards is a logical way to reduce this risk. In many countries outside the US, back-in parking is more prevalent, and in some it's even the norm. And we could all spend perhaps a little bit of time practicing in an empty parking lot to improve this skill, and with effort, turn our parking lots around. Now, it's a bit ironic because on the day I wrote this piece, I also pulled into a parking lot just a few hours ago, multiple parking lots, and didn't back into any of them. And it didn't occur to me that I'd pulled in the wrong way until well after the fact. And so it's, I think, just more habitual why we pull into a parking lot a certain way rather than logical. Because certainly this topic was front of my mind, and despite that, and despite it being an empty lot, I still parked in my mind backwards.